Hey, I love food. Take one look at me, you can pretty much figure that out. And I'm not alone. I think a lot of us love food. And what's not to love? I mean, it's delicious. There's so many things you could get and make. Homemade enchiladas. That's where it's at right there. But the one thing about food is, you don't really think of it as being dangerous. I mean, yeah, sure, obesity, heart disease, diabetes. Yeah, okay, sure. But for the most part, you don't think of food as being an antagonist, as being something that's out to get you. Or at least I didn't, till I saw all these movies. And now, well, maybe it's not a bad idea to go on a diet.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out our introduction video. There's a link to that in the description below that'll give you a pretty good overview of what the Horror Movie Syllabus is all about. Essentially, we do a deep dive into a particular subgenre of horror, looking at 3 particular movies from that subgenre. Today, we're looking at horror movies about food. And it's worth noting that, pretty much any horror movie could be about food or have food in it at least. So, what we're really focusing on are movies where the food is the threat. It is the scary thing, or it's at least central to the story, or at least the relationship between the characters and the food is central to or essential to the story being told. So that's kind of how we're drawing a fence around it a little bit. But that said, we still have already talked about some movies that kind of prominently feature food. And, this is the horror movie supplement. These are the additional subgenres that we added to the original horror movie syllabus. And we're not going to repeat movies that we've already talked about in the past. So we're not going to be looking at something like, say, Fresh or Raw or Eat or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or frankly, any of the cannibal movies we've already talked about, because, cannibals eat their own kind of food. So, we're not repeating anything, but that's okay, because I think we found some really interesting things here. Now, when it comes to horror movies about food, you take the good and you take the bad, you take them both, and then you have a horror movie syllabus video. It's a mixed bag today. There's some really fantastic, incredible movies in here, and then there's some movies that I'm going to be kind of almost warning you against checking out, maybe some stuff that's maybe here mostly because of its notoriety, and not so much because of its quality. And so in regards to how we're going to look at these today, we're going to rank them in order of undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, like we always do. I'm going to rank them in increasing order of how delicious they are. Why not? This is going to be an interesting ride. Go ahead and take your seats, put your napkin in your lap, and let's go ahead and dig in to these horror movies about food. The first food-based horror movie that we're looking at today, the undergraduate level selection, is The Stuff. The Stuff came out in 1985 and is a bit of a cult favorite for a number of reasons, which we're going to dig into, of course. And it is an interesting thing because it's known so well, even though it's got such a generic, unexplaining title, which is part of the appeal. It's part of what makes it work in terms of not just as a horror movie, but as a bit of a consumer satire as well. But we're going to dig into all of that in just a minute. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about this alien substance that gets found underground, dug up by some guys who inexplicably taste it and find out that it's delicious and decide to wind up marketing it as The Stuff, basically a no-calorie ice cream substitute treat that kind of takes America by storm. People love it. People can't get enough of it, but it's doing something to them. It is making them not the same, and it's having a very adverse effect because it is, again, alien in origin, and people don't realize it. They don't really know what they're eating when they're eating the stuff, and a group of people are going on a crusade to try to educate people and thwart the threat, and hijinks abound as they make those efforts, of course. The Stuff is a fun movie if you can get into it. It's directed by Larry Cohen, the director of movies like It's Alive and Q, which we've talked about in the past. And Larry Cohen, he is an interesting and noteworthy filmmaker in the horror genre, and he is bringing some really cool stuff to the screen here because, as I alluded to earlier, this is not just a straight horror movie. It's kind of an homage to like 1950s monster movies, and like most notably something like The Blob, for example. And it's also at the same time working as this like consumer satire, like a satiring of America's consumer culture, and it's fairly on the nose with that. So it's both heavy-handed but also rather clever at the same time. Throughout the movie, you have advertisements like scattered through, and there's like little bylines going by with little funny things talking about the sales, and it's a really interesting look at how people approach media, how they approach advertising, and how the way this gets sold as this miracle product that is delicious and you can't get enough of it. It's essentially addictive, and they're even advertising that it's addictive, and yet and there's no calories like that. It's basically too good to be true, and nobody's questioning it because the media is just pushing it on them. It's a fun aspect of the movie, one that holds up extremely well considering this movie is 40 years old. It really works for me, and it benefits from Cohen's direction, of course, including the actors that he's got in there, and most notably Michael Moriarty as the star of the movie, as a guy investigating the stuff, trying to convince everybody not to eat it. And he is great as always. Michael Moriarty always bringing his A game, no matter what the project is. And this is a silly movie, really, when you kind of take a step back and look at it, but he is taking it 100% seriously. He is 100% giving his all, which is what makes him good and which makes the movies good too. The movies that he's in, he kind of elevates that stuff to make it work, frankly. But I have to mention Paul Sorvino as the army general guy that comes to help Moriarty fight the stuff, because he is a total scene stealer. He knows that he's in a campy movie, and Sorvino known for some really great dramatic roles and stuff, and he's got a very foreboding presence. He's just a big, kind of hulking, kind of intimidating guy, and he is absolutely hysterical here. The way he's hitting onto the reporter, and the way that he's kind of like trying to just be like kind of famous, and yet he's also just kind of over the top, like right-wing militant. It's really, really funny, but the movie does a good job of writing that comedy horror line. Like it's mostly funny. It's just, like I said, satirical, and you're watching this this marshmallow cream looking thing kind of overtake people. But when it starts like consuming people and kind of coming out of them and basically turning them into whatever it turns them into, it's wild. It really is. It's kind of on par with The Blob. I mean, that's actually a really apt comparison, because it really does hit that tone of, kind of being consumed. The stuff that you're eating is eating you. And that's the point. I think that's why it's even called The Stuff, is because it kind of can apply to so many other things that we eat that are bad for us, that really harm us from the inside. And the stuff is taking that and literalizing that and making it into like a monster movie. And it's a whole lot of fun. Now, I'm not going to lie, the movie does drag a little bit at times, kind of in the middle and stuff like that. But when it's got the the marshmallow cream kills, it's working really, really well for me. And as it ramps up towards the ending, it really takes off, and it's got kind of a bleak, satirical ending, which is in tone with the movie and in tone with Cohen's sensibilities. So it's all working really well as this like absurd, satirical, goofy movie. It's a goofy movie. I don't want to oversell it as scary, because it's not terribly scary, but it is funny and it is entertaining. It's a great watch, and I can see why it is a cult fave. I'm part of the cult. I'm into this movie, and it's got a notoriety for a reason. I think its messaging, while maybe arguably a little heavy-handed, still rings true today. It still has the same impact, the same meaning as it did back when it came out. And I think that's a neat thing. I think that this movie holds up rather well thematically, if not necessarily completely, in terms of effects and pacing and things like that. But none of that's bad enough to take you out of the movie. It really is a solid, fun movie, a great director, great cast, and it just really, really works for me. And hopefully it'll work for you too. I'm recommending you guys check it out if you haven't seen it before, and then come in and let me know what you think. But I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this stuff. Have you got your own thoughts on this? Have you got your own opinions? Am I overselling it? Am I underselling it? But tell me if I'm selling the stuff correctly. The next food-based horror movie we're looking at today, the graduate level selection, is The Platform. The platform came out in 2019 and was a bit of a sensation shortly after it came out because it came out shortly before the pandemic hit, and it was released on, I think it was Netflix, one of the streaming services, and really took off when the pandemic hit. It really got big right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think it's because people really resonated with some of the themes and the setting and tone of this movie, this rather bleak movie. If you haven't seen it before, the movie is about this tower that's like 300 stories high, with a hole in the center of it, and every floor has two people on there, and there is a platform of food that is lowered every day, floor by floor. And at the beginning, the top of the tower, it has a full thing of food, and as the tower goes down or the platform goes down, it gets eaten slowly, bit by bit. Every 2 minutes, the platform stops on a different floor. So that as you get to the lower level, there's less and less and less food until eventually there's no food at all. And then every month, the people get shuffled on the floors. And it's really interesting to see how they react to, potentially having too much food, not enough food, starving to death, and the hijinks abound, of course. And it's a really interesting social experiment type movie. It really is exploring themes of the human condition, human nature, and it's really making a critique on things like capitalism versus socialism, and honestly, it's doing it a little bit clunkily. If I'm being honest with you, the political messaging in this movie is a little obvious. It's a little bit clunky. They're kind of hitting you over the head about it because the characters at some point actually just start having these philosophical debates about it as they try different ways to get the people on the lower levels their food. And that's fine. It works perfectly fine because the premise is really, really good. This concept of this platform that lowers down and stays 2 minutes on every level is great, and they've really accounted for like every idea I could think of about like trying to jump to another level or trying to steal some food and keep it with you. They don't let you do these things. They really have found out every way to make this work so that you can't cheat the system. You can't thwart it by doing something that would be obvious and easy, like keep some food for yourself or distribute it out or whatever. They address every idea I could think of. So the premise, while honestly kind of sci-fi and unbelievable, it really they did a good job of making it feel realistic, feel kind of hopeless and bleak and like unbeatable. And I really think that's what made the movie so strong for me. Now it's interesting. It's worth noting the movie is a Spanish film. It's in Spanish, and so the political, commentary is ostensibly about Spain, but it really applies perfectly fine to America and probably to a large portion of, if not the entire world as a whole. In fact, you could argue that the movie's themes are global in scope and nature and concept. The idea of people going hungry and the haves versus the have-nots is are honestly a universal concept, a universal theme, but it works really well on a macro level globally and in a micro level, like just looking at the United States. It really does work. Like I said, it is a little heavy-handed, but it's first of all it's heavy-handed, but it's also trying to be even-handed. It's really criticizing both capitalism and socialism and showing the flaws of each concept. So it's trying to kind of have a balanced presentation of the arguments and the concepts, which works for me. I like that idea. But the real reason why it works for me and doesn't turn me off is because of how good it is. It's made really, really well. The concept is simple. It's a cheap movie to make, but it's shot really well. It's paced really well, and they've got great actors in there that are carrying the show. Like the first two actors, the first two guys that are paired up, and they change as the movie goes on. But the first two guys are great. Apparently, they're actually known more for like comedy. I'm not familiar with either actor, but they're known more for comedy, and they're playing it mostly serious here. But there's a dry, like bleak black humor underlying this entire movie that works extremely well. And then there is a lot of gore and a lot of violence, and it is a very, very bleak movie. Like when they introduce the dog, it's not going to end well. You know this. And there's just some really horrific stuff that, blessedly, some of the really, really off putting stuff happens off screen. So it's not a total traumatizing event to watch it, but it is a very dark movie. It's not really pulling punches, it's really trying to show how bad things can get, how bleak things can get. And it's not really pulling the punches all that much other than showing the stuff off screen is it's really making the message work for me because, like I said, while it might be a little clunky and obvious, and sometimes it just feels like exposition, people like spouting political concepts. The movie's paced well enough and it's made well enough, and it's visceral enough that it still works for me. It still hits for me. That premise is so strong. The concept, the sci-fi concept of this platform, that you can't even see the machinery that lowers the platform. It's almost as if by magic. It really works. It really sells it. And it's easy to see why people really latched onto this during the pandemic because it underscored that feeling of isolation that people would have, these two people that are isolated on each floor, and then the ability to connect, or not, the inability to connect with people on other floors, and how hard it is to forge meaningful relationships, and everybody's kind of out for themselves, and trying to procure food. In those early days of the pandemic, when everybody's worried about rationing stuff, and being able to get enough stuff to survive. This movie must have hit extremely well. I saw it later on, but this movie must have hit extremely well at that time. So I can see why it was appealing to people, why it would, really resonate with people during the COVID times. I also can see why maybe people wouldn't have wanted to check it out. It's a testament to how good the movie is that people were drawn to it as much as they were. I would recommend being drawn to it as well. I think this movie is excellent. I think it's an incredibly well made movie, and it really moves me. But it also, like I said, it's got its flaws, but I think the good far outweighs the bad in this one, and I really recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it before. And of course, if you've seen it, let me know what you think of it because, like I said, it's some heavy-handed political messaging that turns a lot of people off. Does it turn you off? Let me know in the comments below. And the last food-based horror movie we're exploring today, the postgraduate level selection, is The Menu. The Menu came out in 2022 and was another one of these movies that was a big streaming hit. It seemed like it really found its audience on streaming, and really was a big buzz, a big popular mainstream buzz. Everybody was talking about this movie. Even people who don't like horror movies seem to find this movie and gravitate towards it. It really worked. And when you see it for yourself, it's really easy to understand why, because across the board, this movie's pretty much nailing everything that it's trying to nail, and it's doing so masterfully. Obviously, I like this one. So if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a celebrity chef who has invited an exclusive group of people to a private island where he's going to be serving an exclusive meal, a very posh, elaborate meal that he's planned out a whole evening around. And it's really to celebrate his final performance as a chef, basically his swan song, if you will. Only the evening starts getting darker and darker and darker as the guests start to realize that maybe their lives are in danger, and hijinks start to abound, as they always do when you get invited to celebrity chefs' restaurants on private island. So, in case you didn't know, the movie is excellent for a number of reasons. But the main reason is the cast. The movie stars Anya Taylor-Joy as our main protagonist and Ray Fiennes as the celebrity chef. But it's got Nicholas Hoult, it's got John Leguizamo, it's got a number of recognizable actors in there doing smaller roles that are really hit for Hong Chow. We'll get to Hong Chow in just a minute. But the actors are really like the bones of this movie. They are the things that hold this together and make it work, especially Anya Taylor-Joy and Ray Fiennes. The chemistry between the two of them, the interplay, is absolutely fantastic. I don't want to spoil the movie too much for you, but the two of them are, first, they're both powerhouse actors. We've talked about both of them individually on the channel before in other movies, and they are always bringing it. I'm a very big fan of both of them. To see them face off together is fantastic, and it really works, and it really sells the movie for me. Anya Taylor-Joy in particular, A, because she's Anya Taylor-Joy, but B, because she's like our entryway. She's our eyes into this world of like very extravagant meals, upper class people, and their relationship with food and with dining. It's really a wonderful send up or satire of this culture, and it hits for me very well. Having spent a little bit of time in the foodie universe myself, I am familiar with some of this kind of culture, some of this very posh, and let's just call it what it is, like aristocratic, arrogant, and pretentious lifestyle that this the kind of fawning over food almost like sexualizing it, just kind of fetishizing it so much. And it's kind of like wine culture, like people who are really into it are really into it. And there seems to be a certain level of pretension to it. And this movie is hitting that hard. It is playing off of that really, really well. And I love it. It really nails down like the ludicrousness of the way people act about fine dining, and just it sends it up so well, and I absolutely love it. I was literally, when I saw this movie, and again I came to it a little later than everybody else, but when I saw, I was like clapping. I was like so into it, and again, it's because you've got Anya Taylor-Joy reacting the way most of us would probably react in these situations with these, highfalutin restaurateurs and their customers just kind of being, over the top about their food. It's great. And then all of the other, actors in there, all the people playing the different customers are really selling it. They're selling that pretension. They're selling that kind of like set apartness of like from reality. Like their whole perspective is just off from like the general public's, and they're selling that. It really works well. Nicholas Holt is great as the guy who's just so super into food to the point where he's actually just kind of pissing you off. But Hong Chow, I told you I'd get back to Hong Chow because she plays like the maitre d, and she is a scene stealer. Every scene she's in, she is just taking that and running with it, which is no small feat considering the amount of other people, the amount of other talent in the room. She is that tortilla scene where she is explaining what a tortilla is I was laughing out loud. So it's so great. It's so funny, and she's just selling that kind of like air of superiority and that kind of condescension so well. I love Hong Chow. She is one of my favorite parts of the movie, but the movie itself is just hidden for me. The food is gorgeous in there. It looks amazing. I'm not going to lie to you. Again, I know a little bit about the foodie universe. I can appreciate some fine dining, even though if I can understand the ridiculousness of it as well. The food looks good. Yeah, it looks really good. But this premise, this idea of this celebrity chef doing his final bow, and I don't want to get into it too much, although you probably have a good idea just because it's a horror movie that it's not going to go well for the customers. It's really great. The idea of how this movie kind of feels slightly sinister at first, slightly foreboding, and just gets more and more so, and then it just goes way off the rails, really fast. It's fantastic. And I love that concept. I love the premise of this celebrity chef and his relationship with his customers and how it drives his motivation, his own ego, and his own relationship with food itself. And again, filtered through the eyes of Anya Taylor-Joy as the outsider looking in, who is basically the surrogate for us, the audience. It's a masterful movie. It really is. It's just really well made. They filmed it in a way so that it looks kind of like some of these food documentaries that you see. In fact, I think when I did a little bit of research on it, they hired people who had worked on, I forget what the name of the actual documentary, but somebody who had done these documentaries before, so they could film it to look like that. And they really did a great job of this. And the way they have like the recipes or the ingredients listed for every meal, every course, it's absolutely fantastic. It's hysterical, it's creepy, and it's just really, really great. If you've not seen the menu, highly recommend you check this one out. Like I said, even non-horror fans seem to like this one because it resonates, man. That whole haves and have nots thing again. It really does click for people to see how this goes. Again, I don't want to spoil it and talk too much about how it goes sideways, but it does. So check it out if you haven't seen it, and come back and let me know what you think. So that's going to do it for our taste test of horror movies about food. But if you're like me and you love food, you're going to want to check out some of these extra credit movies, or maybe you're not. Let's get into that right now. The first extra credit movie I'm going to mention to you is Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Attack of the Killer Tomatoes came out in 1978. And I'll be honest with you, I saw this movie when I was a kid, not exactly when it came out, but probably a couple of years after that. And I remember enjoying this movie quite a bit. I remember the theme song. It's a pretty well-known theme song. And it really does stick with you. It's very catchy. And I remember thinking this movie was fun. And I revisited it for this, for this video. I hadn't seen it in quite some time. And man, I really don't know why I liked this so much as a kid, but we're going to get into that in just a second. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is essentially what the title is selling you. These killer tomatoes wind up attacking the world, and it is difficult for people to convince the world that this is happening. So you've got a ragtag group of people trying to convince the world to be wary of tomatoes as they get bigger and larger and start attacking people. And the the government has to try to get involved and everything. And there's of course media issues of trying to cover things up and stuff. And it is trying to again spoof monster movies and things like that, kind of like the stuff, but it's not doing it as well as you would like it to do. It really is kind of a drag of a movie, at least by today's standards. And I question whether it was actually not a drag back then too. Like the jokes are very stale. They're very stale and old, and it's a comedy, right? It's a spoof of monster movies, and it's occasionally a musical. Why I don't know, but occasionally characters just break out into song and dance. They just and it's not consistently enough to actually call this movie a musical, but it happens more than once. It happens like 3 or 4 times in the movie that people just start singing and dancing, and I guess that's funny. I don't know. Like the comedy in this movie falls very very flat for me. Again, a lot of the jokes, a lot of the satire that they're doing, a lot of the spoofing they're doing is very, very dated at this point. It's like, 40 plus years old at this point. And so it's not really hitting the way that it, probably did back then. But again, as a kid, I'm wondering, was this funny to me as a kid? Because it really doesn't feel like it would be. As a kid, I think I would have liked the tomatoes attacking because that was really funny. And it does hold up, like seeing these giant tomatoes that really basically look like painted beach balls or something like that, kind of bouncing out towards people is pretty funny. Though I wish, by today's standards, I wish that, the tomatoes were actually a little bit more gory and you could actually see them really devouring people and stuff like that. That would be cool. Like the cover art for the movie is much cooler looking than any of the scenes of the tomatoes attacking. But when the tomatoes are attacking, at least I'm having a good time at that point. And then there's like, occasionally a joke that'll work, like the slow car speed chase, which is apparently kind of infamous because it inspired pretty much any other slow car speed chase you've seen since then. That was pretty funny. That's pretty good, but it's few and far between. The stuff that works for me is few and far between. It really does drag. And there's a tremendous amount of stuff that just feels like it's trying very hard to be funny and really missing the mark. And again, I don't feel like this is just because it's dated humor either. I think it was probably pretty flat back at the time. And when I look back at the reviews and stuff like that, that bears true. Like it really did not get a lot of good critical acclaim or anything like that. But it did become kind of a cult hit. And I feel like the cult notoriety of this movie is based more on the title of it and the concept of it than the actual movie itself. I feel like a lot of the people know about this movie but probably haven't actually seen this movie, and I hadn't seen it in God knows how long. And so I was shocked when I watched it just how much of a slog it felt like. So I'm not really recommending it to you here. Now, there are a couple sequels, and most notably the second movie, the first sequel has a young George Clooney in one of his first starring roles in there. And I think maybe it's been a while since I've seen that one. I did not rewatch that one for this video because I didn't have time. But that one might be one that maybe is a little bit more fun, really focuses more on the fun aspects of the movie, the tomato attacks and things like that. And so maybe that's really what sticks out in people's minds more rather than the original. But the original, not great, man. Not great. I'm not really recommending it to you in this extra credits so much as I'm just making you aware of it because it's notorious, it's well known, but maybe skip it, or maybe like if you can find like a riff tracks or something like that for it, that would be good because that may make it more fun to watch because honestly, it's a bit of a drag. The second extra credit movie I'm going to mention is The Ice Cream Man. The Ice Cream Man came out in 1995, and it stars Clint Howard in a not a career-defining role necessarily, but it's one of the roles that he's very, very famous for. And this is a movie that has a very big cult following, but it's not the greatest of movies, but it sure is a lot of fun. And unlike the Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, it knows when to have a good time. It knows when to lean into that fun aspect of the movie and not drag it out too long. But we're gonna get into that in just a second. If you haven't seen it before, the movie is about an ice cream man with played by Clint Howard who has some mental issues, and he is basically putting his victims. He's killing people and putting his victims into the ice cream and making some really horrific, gory ice cream treats that have some unfortunate surprises mixed inside of them. And there's a group of kids that are kind of into kind of cluing into this when one of them goes missing, and they're trying to find their friend and find out what's going on. And of course, people don't believe them, and hijinks abound as they tend to do in movies like this. And this movie is basically a slasher movie, right? It's a slasher movie with this ice cream man angle on it, and that works for me. As you know, I love me a good slasher movie, so I'm already predisposed to like this one. Here's the interesting thing. The movie has a really solid cast. Like Clint Howard is really great in this movie, but it's got some other people in there that are really good. And then it's got Steve Garvey, former Dodger legend Steve Garvey in this movie, and he's actually not bad in the movie. But there are some recognizable faces here. There are also some child actors, and I'll be honest, the child actors aren't great, and nobody's actually great in this. There's some really solid talent in here, but nobody's really great. They're all pretty cheesy, but it works for the movie because the movie is cheesy and the movie knows that it's cheesy. It's not trying to be something it's not. It knows it's a silly slasher movie with a really kind of a ridiculous premise that is kind of unbelievable, and it's running with that. It's okay with that. It knows what it is, and all the actors seem to be in on the joke. They're all kind of hamming it up a little bit big. Like I said, the kids are not great. They're not really selling it realistically, but you don't care because it's a good time. The movie knows when to have fun. Now, the one thing I would nitpick about it is that it doesn't do the really cool, gross, gory stuff all the way through. There are some lulls in this movie where you could use some gore gags that it doesn't give to you. It gets sprinkled throughout, like sprinkles on ice cream, I guess, early on. But when it gets to that third act, it gets fun. It really leans into the gore aspect to it, and it really gets really messed up, really demented, and really sick. And if you were to like kind of take yourself out of the fun and campy aspect of this and think about it realistically, it's a really dark movie and really, really cool. But that ending, I wish it was kind of like more that kind of pace and more that kind of gory aspect and fun and campy and over the topness a little bit more throughout. But that is a minor nitpick because this movie is fun, it's well paced, it's made well. Again, it just knows what it is. It's a low budget affair. It's a cheesy 80s slasher made in the 90s basically, and that's cool, and that's why I think it's got the cult following that it does. People do love this movie. Not I said a huge cult following. It's not really necessarily huge because I guess they did try to make like a crowd-funded sequel to this movie that would actually be involving Clint Howard. I'm not quite sure how, but that's a whole other story. But I guess it didn't actually work, and so I'm kind of calling out the Ice Cream Man fans. Like, what the hell? Like why is there not a sequel to this movie? It seems like it would be the kind of franchise that you just do direct to video stuff and just have a lot of fun with. But again, minor nitpicks, minor complaints. The movie is fun. I want to set your expectations. It's not a good movie. It's a dumb movie. It's stupid. It's dumb. It's got bad acting in there, but it's intentionally bad. It really is, except for the kids. It really is trying to be campy and having a good time, and it's doing a pretty good job of it. For a movie that's trying to intentionally be campy, I think it's nailing it. I think it really is a good time. But you have to like these kind of movies. You have to like schlocky slasher horror movies that are really campy. If you that sounds like your jam, Ice Cream Man's for you, and frankly, you've probably already seen it. So if you have thoughts on Ice Cream Man, leave them in the comments below for those who haven't seen it. Try to convince them to check it out because I do like Ice Cream Man quite a bit, I think more people should check it out because I'd like to see that sequel. And the last extra credit movie I'm going to mention today is a movie called 301 302. 301 302 came out in 1995 and is a South Korean horror movie. Although I use that term horror very loosely because this really almost feels more like a drama, like a really dark drama with some really messed up, horrific things in there. A lot of messed up, horrific things in there. But the movie itself doesn't feel super duper scary, but we're going to get into all that in just a second here. If you haven't seen the movie before, and I wouldn't be surprised because it's kind of an obscure movie, the movie is about two women that live in adjoining apartments, 301 and 302. And one woman is a chef. She's a cook. She's really into making food, and she's recently divorced, and she really loves food, and she's very outgoing. And her neighbor is really reclusive, and she's anorexic, and she's a writer, and the one woman keeps trying to bring her food and trying to make friends with her, and the other woman is turned off by the food and keeps throwing it away and vomiting. And it starts to escalate a little bit where the woman who's trying to feed her kind of crosses some lines and things get really really dark and really really strange, and each of their backstories are very 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 dark, and hijinks abound, I guess. I don't know, yeah, hijinks abound, yeah. This is a strange movie, and I debated whether or not to put it in here because it's a little bit more obscure and a little bit, it's very strange, and it's not super horrific really. But I decided to put it in here, A, because I like it, B, because hardly anybody seems to know about it and I wanted to bring up something a little bit more rare, but C, because it really is focused on the relationship with food. You've got one woman who's overindulging in food and another woman who's not indulging enough in food. And when the two meet and they clash, it really makes for some interesting dramatic tension and leading to some really awful, awful stuff. But you also get to see some of the background and psychology of why they are the way they are and why they have these relationships with food. And there's some really beautiful food being made in here too. My knock on this movie, and the reason why I was hesitant to put it on more than anything else, is because it looks really cheap, really low budget. Honestly, it looks like a really low budget 90s TV show. And I don't know if this is just because of South Korea, but it looks not very cinematic. Now, the director is a very accomplished director. I wasn't familiar with him, but he apparently worked all throughout the 80s and 90s. So it's not like he's a novice or anything like that. But the movie just looks very flat for the most part, very unimaginative, very basic. Every once in a while, he lucks into some shots that are really cool and really interesting, but for the most part, the movie it's very functional. It tells the story just fine, but there's no panache to it. There's no artistry to it. There's no flair or style to the camera work, to the setups, to the lighting, to the sets, any of it. And it looks like cheap television, like very rudimentary, functional, basic. And so it's a little bit hard to watch because it feels like you're not watching a movie exactly. But then that also kind of works a little bit because it adds a little bit to the verisimilitude of the story. And when you get into some of the background and stuff, some of the darker aspects of this, that can be really, really unsettling. Now, I don't know if it's so much so to be a trigger warning because most of this stuff's happening off screen and it's mostly implied or talked about rather than actually shown. But you've got like sexual assault and incest and animal harming and abuse and like there's just some really messed up stuff in this movie, but the vast majority of it is again off screen and more kind of alluded to or discussed rather than shown. But these dark aspects of it are what really make the movie for me. It really is interesting to see these layers that these women have and what drives their motivations and their psyches because they are both damaged women who have some mental issues going on that are not being properly addressed or treated. And that's what's leading to this inevitable conflict that arises. And it's, maybe a little bit predictable, to be honest with you, although the ending is a little bit nebulous and vague, also arguably an ambiguous ending. But it's interesting to see that, while you know where this is going, it's still very compelling, at least for me. I find this movie to be very compelling. I was very wrapped up in it, very caught up in what was going on and wanting to know what was going to happen, even though I kind of already knew where it was going and I wasn't wrong. It really works for me very well because of these dark undertones, these dark concepts, which is interesting because they did do an American remake of this, and of course it was a watered down version of it that I've never seen this. It's called Compulsion. It stars Heather Graham and Carrie Ann Moss. Yeah, I haven't seen it, and I'm not really that inclined to because from all accounts it just strips out all of the stuff about 301 302 that is dark and upsetting and really focuses more on like celebrity fame and stuff like that and a little more trite sounding to me. So and it wasn't a hit or anything like that. So I'm not terribly motivated to check out Compulsion, but I would like ask you to check out 301 302 if you can track it down. It's not the easiest movie to find, but it really is an interesting movie. I guess that's what I'd use for it. Not terribly scary, a little bit upsetting and disturbing, but really interesting. I would actually like to see this movie remade, but keeping the original themes like that, but just with like a better eye. Give it a little bit more mood and tone and atmosphere to it because it really could use it. The tone of the movie, the way it's shining, it doesn't align with the concepts and the ideas that are being bandied about. So that's my biggest issue with it, but there's the bones there of something really great and it's just really interesting to me and I'm curious if it's interesting to any of you. So check it out and let me know what you think of it, please, in the comments. And if you've seen it, please let me know what you think of it because I haven't really talked to anybody who's seen this movie. Like I said, it seems like it's a little under the radar, a little more obscure, so I'd really like to hear other people's thoughts and we can get a conversation going in the comments. So that's going to do it for our exploration into horror movies about food. Like I said, I love food and I love horror movies about food. I don't love all of these movies, though, if I'm being perfectly honest with you. There are some clunkers here, but for most part, I like most of these very much, or if not downright loving them. But with the exception of Detective the Killer Tomatoes, every one of them is at least worth your time. So there's that. So check them out, and let's keep the conversations going. But for now, let's go on to our horror trivia pursuit card. As you know, it's that time of the video where I like to talk about, try to answer a horror trivia pursuit card without cutting the camera, so you can see if I answer right. And let's go ahead and let's do the psychological category, to kind of represent the psychological relationship with food. Why not? Because we haven't done psychological category in a long time. So let's just do that. So here is the question. What was the name of the Stephen King novel that the 1989 film Pet Sematary is adapted from? This feels like a trick question to me, and I'm going to explain. But first, if you haven't seen Pet Sematary, we actually talked about Pet Sematary on the channel, and if you saw that video, not my favorite movie. I know that there are a lot of people who love that movie, and I think if you were the right age when you saw that movie, it really resonated for you and really stuck with you. I was maybe a little too old for it when I saw it. I'm not a fan of that movie. But I am aware that the book is better than the movie, which is honestly true for a lot of Stephen King projects, that they read better than they adapt. Like, the adaptations can be a little flat. We've talked about Stephen King extensively on the channel. We talked about a lot of his videos, and it's hit and miss. It's hit and miss. A lot of his movies are really great. A lot of them not so much so. I'd say more good than bad for the most part, but I may be wrong on that. I don't think, because there's like 60 or 70 adaptations. It's really a lot. And I'm prattling on a little bit to give you a little bit of time to think about this. But I'm going to explain my thought process. So start to lock in your answer here. I think this is a trick question, because the way that it's worded would imply that maybe it's part of one of the anthology books, Stephen King, like, different seasons, or Night Shift or something like that. But I am 99% sure that's not the case. I am almost positive that it's its own book. Like, in fact, even the way the question's worded, it sounds like it's saying its own book. It's not saying, short story or anything like that. And I am, like I said, 99% sure that A, it's its own book, it's a full-length novel, and B, that it's just Pet Cemetery, that it's not called something different. I'm almost positive that the book is called Pet Cemetery, just like the movie. So that's my answer, Pet Cemetery. So you got your answer locked in. Let's look at the card and see. Pet Cemetery. The film and novel share the same name. So yeah, it's trying to trick me a little bit there. And it really did throw me off, because, it's like, oh, the book that Pet Cemetery is based on is Pet Cemetery, right? And the way they worded it, and I started to second guess myself. Like, was it a short story? I started, second guessing myself, because I have read some King back in the day when I was a kid. I'm not a big King avid reader these days, and I'm by no means a King expert when it comes to the books. But I was like, I'm pretty sure Pet Sematary is its own book, and I'm pretty sure, like, it's called Pet Sematary. So that was a weird question, man. I've got it right, so hopefully you guys got it right too. That was kind of a weird one. I feel like they tried to trick me a little bit, but you couldn't get the professor. Anyways, I hope you guys had a good time. I hope you guys are hungry and go eat something. We'll maybe watch one of these movies while you're eating, but be careful about that. Next week we'll be doing something completely different. But until then, class dismissed.